I know that Rabbi Geoff Mitelmann doesn't need much introduction to the good folks of St. Luke's, but it's worth just saying what a blessing it is to have you back with us, and a blessing to be in partnership with you and with Sinai and Synapses, and always learn a lot from these conversations. So we're looking forward to the thought-provoking title, "How to Be a Realistic Optimist."
Thank you. Yeah, this is this is an interesting question. It's great to be with you all. Been teaching with many of you for 5 or 6 years now. It's always a pleasure to be able to be with you and to be able to learn and study here. So how can we have a level of rational optimism? Because I think that is a challenge that we're facing in this world. There's a great joke that I love. Israel just celebrated its 73rd anniversary of its Declaration of Independence. It's a Hebrew word is Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Declaration of Independence, and the name of the Israeli national anthem is Hatikva, which means the hope. And there's a great joke about an American person who moves to Israel and makes Aliyah. And if you've ever been to Israel or ever interacted with Israelis, that there's a tremendous amount of bureaucracy that happens in Israel here. And so the American moves to Israel and tries to be able to set up for his internet connection. And he's waiting a week and there's no internet connection. And he does 2 weeks and there's still no internet connection. And eventually, after about a month of not being able to connect online, which is really hard when you're not able to connect up with the internet, he's able to goes to the company that runs the internet company and says, look, I've been waiting for a month to be able to have my internet connected. I'm doing everything on my phone. Why are you not able to get this internet connect working? And the man says, points to this giant stack of papers that are here and says, look at all of these people ahead of you. And the man is crestfallen and says, oh, so does that mean that there's no hope? I'm going to have my internet connected? And the man very sternly says, it is forbidden for a Jew to say there is no hope. No chance, maybe. And we talk, this is what we think about. What is this difference of being able to say hope? When can we have hope and something that's realistic versus something that is sort of Pollyanna-ish? Because this is a real challenge. We look at our world right now, and it is a scary place. And I actually want to start, if we can have our first poll, hopefully this will work. So we're going to put a poll out here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about the world today? So 1 is absolutely terrible. 5 is so-so. 2 or 3 is like things are not great. 6 or 7 is things are actually really good, and 10 is, oh my God, this is the best possible world that we've ever had. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about the world today? And this could be about anything about economics, it can be about politics, it can be about your own personal life. On a scale of 1 to 10, so take just a moment and fill out this poll here. I got some 3. All right, so there are a couple of 3s. Oh well, a lot of people are about a 6, which is good. That's all right. So I would love to unpack of those of you who gave different numbers here. I mean, yeah, sort of in the range of 3 to 6 in this kind of way. So we can end the poll. I'm going to send you the next one here to be able to send to get out when we're ready for this. So I'm going to end this poll. So the numbers are, there were 2 people said a 3, 3 people said a 5, 4 people said a 6. I would love to just for people to be able to share a little bit about why they said the number that they chose. And I'm going to send the next poll to be able to send out here. So why don't you unmute and share a little bit of why you thought, what was the thought process of the number that you had here? So you can unmute and we'd love to just go ahead.
Well, that famous line from Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, is always true for all times. I think we went for 6 rather than 5 because it's sunny out.
So some of it, right? This is so right. If this was if we were to think of if I were to ask you this in January or November, when it was cold and gross and snowy, your numbers might have been a little bit lower, right? Right. Today is this glorious, wonderful day. So right now we're feeling good in this kind of way. So it may have been a little bit different. And I think that's an important thing that we'll come back to, of how are we feeling in a moment versus how do we think about it in retrospect. Other thoughts here? Yeah.
I also went with 6 in part. So my initial reaction was closer to 3. You know, the shooting in Indianapolis, just the reality, so many things, the broken political system. It's like, how, you know, 80% of Americans think we should have, you know, rational gun legislation. You know, the NRA used to think we should have rational gun legislation, and yet it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Broken politics. So my initial reaction was like 3 or 2. And then I was just reflecting in my own heart, though, that I know that for me, at least, having a degree of hope is the only way, like, I can get out of bed and try to make a difference in the face of those 3s. And that gratitude, for me, I'm becoming more aware of how essential a spiritual discipline that is, because my heart just goes the other way so often. And so if I can intentionally practice gratitude and remember the good things, then it gives me the strength I need to, like, do something about the 3s. So I was like trying to think of the things that I'm grateful for. And so that's how I got to 6.
So
one of my favorite songs ends with the line, "On the days when my gratitude exceeds my expectations, I have real good days."
Well, and I just want to reply to Reverend Fleener here of that, because it's a great point. Because our immediate emotional reaction, and this is, and we've talked about this because I talk a lot about science and these elements, that evolutionarily, it makes much more sense to react to the negative. It is a much better strategy to be able to say, let me focus on the things that are currently going wrong, because there are a lot more ways for the world to go wrong than it is to go right. And we'll talk about also why we tend to focus so much on the negative. That's our negative piece. But having an intentional spiritual practice, that hope is something that is consciously brought in. Optimism is something that can be cultivated in this kind of way. I think for a lot of people, we look at the world and our immediate emotional reaction is, boy, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And that is our natural immediate emotional reaction. But there are ways that we can do to be able to lift ourselves up. So we're going to talk about some ways, both spiritually and scientifically, to raise that number. But I think for a lot of people, the immediate number is often a 2 or a 3 when you wake up first thing in the morning and you read the headlines. Yeah, go ahead, Martha.
Well, I think I tend to take a long view on these things, because I had a 6 also. Because in the 16th century, I think the scientist Malthus predicted that humans would, the population of the earth would quickly outbreed the amount of agriculture we could have to support that. That didn't help. That didn't happen. And if I look at all of the horrible things that the earth has gone through in countries, and we kind of get panicked, but somehow people have the ingenuity and the fear and the drive. We somehow get ourselves out of these horrible messes. We got out of, World War, not unscathed, of course, World War II. We've gotten out of even this horrible pandemic, we're sort of getting out of that. And every time you think it's hopeless, even the climate crisis and everything, although we, I feel horrible for all of us who are suffering because of these things. There is, if you take the historical view, we've gotten out of a lot, and I think we will get out of this too somehow.
So you bring up a really interesting point, because I think the poll, because neither of us have tried polling, so I'm gonna put this in the chat, because you bring up an interesting question. I'm gonna put it in the chat here, but I'm gonna ask a similar kind of question that what I asked, thinking about compared to where we were a year ago, and think about April 18th, 2020, I'm going to put this in the chat and you can either think about it or reflect on it. How is the world as compared to 1 year ago? Is it much worse? Being a 1, about the same, or a 5 or 10 is much better? Think of where we were a year ago and with COVID and the numbers there. And you can either type that in or you can think about it. Oh yeah, great. Oh, great, perfect. We were able to do this. Terrific. Yep. So you can end there, right? The poll just came in, which is great. And you can fill this poll in here, and let's see it. So now, yeah, now it's like 5s and 8s and 9s is what I'm seeing. There are a couple of these here. Oh, there's one. I'm curious as to who says the 2. It's a little bit more of a difference here. So I'm curious as to where people compare to where we were, for example, a year ago, and thinking about this. And so, yeah, some people are a lot of people are actually about the same. There's some who think that it's much, much worse than we were. So, Martha, you brought up sort of historically compared to a year ago. We're gonna think only about in the last year. How did things work as compared to a year ago? Why have things changed either for the better or the worse since the last year? And I'll open this up for whoever would like to jump in.
Okay, well, I think the vaccine, right?
For a lot, right? The vaccine. I think I'm just going to end the polling here, and then that if we were to say a year ago, we are going to have a gigantic amount of vaccination that we're going to maybe hit herd immunity within 18 months. That would have blown your mind in this kind of way. And if we're thinking about a year ago was one of the, at least in the New York area and Westchester and probably in Connecticut also, it was a really, really scary time. We didn't know, everything was still shutting down. In fact, the numbers, I think that was when the deaths were peaking in New York, was in April. So having a level of the vaccines, of thinking about where we were from a year ago to where we are now, there are elements where there is some hope, but there are a couple of people who said it was kind of about the same or even worse. I'm curious as to who shared that in that way.
Okay, I was a 3, I'll fess up.
Yeah.
On the first question. And I think there just seem to be so many things to worry about. I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full person. That's how I've lived my life. And I think that the COVID shot, there still are a lot of uncertainties about the future. Certainly feel much safer personally having had the shot. I think the thing that really does terrify me is the strength of the rhetoric and divisiveness in this country is just overwhelming, and I don't know how we're going to work through that. And I like Martha's thought that in the past we've had things we didn't know and they did work out, and you need to trust and hope, but you'd like to be part of the process. And anyway.
Right, so that's something that is becoming very concerning for a lot of people, is the political rhetoric and the divisiveness and almost the fracturing of our country, it feels like, and that is a concerning piece. So it's sometimes it can be hard to be optimistic when 50 to 70 million Americans hate 50 to 70 million other Americans, and that's something that's very concerning. Or seeing the shootings that have been happening and the racism that's happening, and it can be very, very hard to be able to think about those kinds of that kind of trajectory here. I'm going to, in a few minutes, talk about a potentially hopeful element of that. But yes, this is something, right? Our immediate reaction is, boy, right? Like, if we're thinking about we think about the halcyon days of how wonderful the political rhetoric was from 2008. But 2008 was also really bad, right? If you remember what the rhetoric was in 2008 or 2012 or 2016 or 2020, but it's been bad, right? Like we think, boy, things were so much better 10 years ago. Like, were they? I think that's at that moment, and we were talking about this of today, oh, it's this glorious sunny day, so it's a 6. But if it had been cold and rainy, it might have been a 3 or a 4. We're focused on this moment right now of where we are, that we sometimes have trouble believing and thinking about the longer term piece of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years in that kind of way. And in a second, I'm going to do one more poll. Lori, do you want to unmute? Are you able to unmute here? If you can say that,
No.
You said that your first, the first response was a 6. It was a global view. Lower is your personal view from last year to this year. So that's also an important piece. And by the way, Derek, I'm going to send you one more poll to be able to launch in just a moment. So I'm going to send that to you by private chat. That there's also the global view, but also the individual view, and that's also a challenge, right? So for some of us, we may have lost somebody to COVID. We may have lost a family member. There may be anxiety or economic instability for ourselves that happens in our life here. So in the wider world, they're like, oh, great, wonderful, we've gotten X number of vaccines, but my uncle died, or I lost my job, right? So there's both the data and the individual stories, and there's a tension in there for sure. But some of that is being able to recognize that a lot of the data is part of a larger collective story. The data is a collection of individual stories in this kind of way. So if we think about where we were from a year ago to this year, I think for a lot of people, we think things are better because the vaccines are coming, we're vaccinated. 2020 was a really hard time in this kind of way. But I want to put one more poll out here. So we can launch this poll. So I want to really think historically. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about the world today as compared to 500 years ago? April 18th, 1521. Is the world better? Is it much worse than it was from 500 years ago? About the same, or is it much better? If you were to be a random person living in, whether that's Europe or North America or Africa, anywhere in the world, would you rather be here? How would you feel about living here as compared to 500 years ago? And I'm saying, now seeing a lot of 8s and 9s. Nobody's below an 8 quite yet. Yeah, lots of 8s and 9s and 10s. And that, right? So if you think there's a 7, there's a trajectory that if you think about it in a really, really, really long term, I'm going to just stop the poll right here. If we think about long term, if you were to find out when and where did you want to be able to live, right? If you had a random roll of the die that you didn't know when or where you were going to live between today and 1521, the year 1521, you would probably honestly pick April 18th, 2021, or maybe somewhere in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe, right? And because if we think about it, COVID has been terrible, right? It's been awful. But think about if it weren't for lockdowns and Zoom and different people, right? How many people would have died with COVID if we didn't have the knowledge of how to be able to understand it, sequence it, come up with the vaccines in 18 months? That is world record time of being able to come up with a vaccine. What someone said, imagine if it had been COVID 2007 and everybody was locked down. Zoom would have been really, really hard to be able to have Zoom and conversations, right? Even in the last 14 or 15 years. We think about what are we able to do from all sorts of being able to have opportunities. If you were a person of color in America in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, it is much better to be now in 2021 than it would have been. You would have been a slave in the 17 or 1800s. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things of thinking about, for example, the divisiveness of the country and the challenges of pieces like racism and gun control and pieces along those lines, why they're so challenging and so infuriating is because we're able to lift them up. They're coming up to the forefront. It used to be that they were sort of swept under the rug, right? This is, you know, being one of the powerful pieces of everything from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter, are people saying people who did not have power previously are able to voice and change power structures in this kind of way. That did not happen 200-300 years ago. And I don't want to say that it's perfect, right? We're not in a utopia, but if you think about the long trajectory of what life has been like over 500 years, 1,000 years, but even 50 years, 5 years, 10 years, the world is slowly getting better in a variety of different ways. I'm going to just pause here for reactions to that, because sometimes that's a little bit controversial. But if you think about in almost every kind of way, if you think about it, we are in a better situation now than we were, however, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 500 years ago. So I'm going to pause here for thoughts and reactions on that. Or pushback. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
I just think it's funny because as a woman, I think, 500 years ago, I would have been like, I'm a woman who's vocal in my community. So I would have been like a witch or something. And I would have been in lots of trouble. So much better for me. But also I studied sociology in school. So looking at it from that standpoint, like it's much better now.
Yeah. Yep, and being able to have more opportunities. Yeah, Ryan, you're it looks like you're cogitating.
Yeah, I think on the whole, I totally agree, right? And certainly in almost every measurable way, it's better. I think there are maybe some categories that it's harder to, it's just different, right? It might be harder to have a value judgment placed on it. We're obviously a lot busier than we were 500 years ago. And there's some benefits to that, right? More access to information, more access to each other. But like, I think one of the things that COVID taught me was that's not always better. And, being able to have like quality time with us, maybe a smaller number of people was maybe a value that we've lost. So on the whole, I agree with you. There are a few niggly places where I think maybe not everything is moving in the right direction.
I think what's complicated with a lot of thinking about history is that there are pieces that we miss, and there's in every religious tradition, every political tradition. I'm going to use these words with lowercase. There is a conservative pull and a liberal pull, and we need both of them, right? We need to be able to have a level of liberality, of being able to have more options and more opportunities and more access. And there are conservative pieces of these are practices and values and communities that conserve, with a lowercase c, conserve the values that have kept the community together for a long time. So being able to say, I find it to be a small c conservative value to be able to have time with my family and time with friends. That is right there. That is a small c conservative value that's gotten lost because the liberal push is pushed in that kind of way. So there's always a trade-off. But one of the things that, for example, COVID came into existence and reached the world for both the pluses and minuses, right? It came and became a global pandemic because we were able to travel all across the world. If it weren't for being able to cross boundaries and borders in airplanes, COVID would have stayed very, very localized. And that's, by the way, it happened with the Black Plague. The Black Plague spread because it was happening through trading. But if you shut borders down, then there are pieces that we lose also, right? So there's trade-offs that happen. And I think also 500 years ago, wonderful thing, being able to have more time with your family, but your family would be probably 8 or 9 kids, 4 or 5 of whom would not survive to the age of 5. And so, right, so there's a trade-off of being able to have, this is what we're able to grow. And there's a thinker named Yuval Harari who has something that's really interesting, big thinker. He wrote a great book called Sapiens. 500 years ago, particularly for those of us who identify as somebody who's religious, 500 years ago, you knew your place in the world and in sort of your religious context. What you did really meant something, and I mean that with a capital M. What you did meant something to God. It meant something to the community. What you did was sacred work, and you felt it and you knew it. And it may have been that there was no upward mobility. There were very clear gender roles that were very stratified there, but you knew your place in the world, and there was not really a question for that. And we've lost this, I think, in our society right now. We don't. There's this struggle for, how do I make sense of the world? How do I find meaning? And the trade-off is that we have gained more and more power over the world, which has a positive and a negative to it, or there's a trade-off there. But because we have given more access, more opportunities, more choices, we tend to think this is a good thing. And I, on balance, do think this is a good thing. But you're right, we have lost. There is an element of meaning that we've lost. Of the number of people who are leaving organized religion in a lot of different ways, right? There's something that we've lost here. But the trade-off is we have a bigger life expectancy. We're able to be able to find vaccines more quickly. We're able to connect with each other differently. There are more opportunities than we would have had otherwise. I'm going to stop talking for a minute, open this up for other thoughts and questions here.
Well, I think social media plays a huge factor here. We're so much more aware, and eventually that will be valuable. It's painful in the transition, though.
Right, and it's not going to be progress and optimism and moving towards a better world is not painless. It is not a straight line. There's backsliding. There's mistakes, and I think so. One of the interesting things about social media is that it highlights both the positives and negatives of this world, right? So, one of the if you want to go see a concert 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, well, we're all sort of in the New York area. You could go to the Met. It's not that hard. You could go to Boston. But if you were in Grand Forks, North Dakota, you saw that was the best you were going to really be able to see was the Grand Forks, North Dakota Orchestra, which I'm sure was lovely. But if you wanted to go to the Met, that was a huge investment. Now click, best opera, right? Or being able to find best whatever it is. You can find whatever you want. And you can find only the best of the different things, and also individual stories can get amplified in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of things are not as, we see so many of these same stories because they get amplified, and whatever's happening in Indianapolis or in Kentucky or wherever it is, that feels like it impacts us. Because we see it all over the world. Everything is much more visible than it was before.
And there are no guidelines for truth.
That's right. That is also a big challenge of how do we be able to grow in this kind of way. So I want to share a little video, and I'm actually going to be, believe it or not, going to be in conversation with him on this upcoming Wednesday. But there's a thinker that I particularly like, and a lot of this is based off of a professor named Steve Pinker, who is at Harvard, at Harvard University, and he's written a couple of books called "The Better Angels of Our Nature" and "Enlightenment Now," and he talks a lot about these kinds of pieces. And his line that I love is, "Follow the trend lines, not the headlines." Right. So there are a couple of different pieces about this. In Judaism, there's a prayer that's said on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that is a very kind of a scary prayer, but it's read on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it became actually a Leonard Cohen song that you may have heard of "Who by Fire," if you know the Leonard Cohen song. And it asks a question. It says, on Rosh Hashanah it's written, on Yom Kippur it is sealed, who shall live and who shall die, who shall be tranquil, who shall be troubled, who will die by fire, who by water, who by strangling, who by stoning, who by wild beasts, all these different horrible ways that we could die. And one of the things that that Pinker talks about is those were right. And if you think about 200 or 300 years ago, if there was a fire in your community, you would probably lose all of your possessions, and you also may die. You also might have died in fires, right? Fires or waters or floods. Those were things that were regular occurrences. Right now, if there is a fire in Darien, right? If somebody's house ends up in Darien, that is going to be newsworthy. That is going to be a story. Why? Because it's rare. And why is it so rare? Well, first of all, there are new materials that are more fire resistant. There are smoke alarms. There's the fire department that can come. There's fire training. Right. If you think about drownings and how many drownings used to be a huge problem. What happens now? Well, now there are more lifeguards. There's water safety. There are fences that are built around here, right? That when if somebody dies by drowning, that is now a story, which really means that that this has become a different piece. And as Pinker says, it is not the headline. It is not a New York Times headline of 80,000 people don't drown today because they've now been trained in water safety. That's not a headline. And it's also not one individual person who's saving this, right? It's a lot of small elements that are happening. So I want to share a short little video of how he talks about some of these different questions here. So let me pull this up. And
yesterday, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty. That could have been the headline in the New York Times every day for the last 25 years. Why wasn't it? My name is Steven Pinker, and that's one of the questions that I raise in my book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Every day when we click on the news, we read stories of terrorism, war, inequality, crime, racism, pollution, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It can feel crushing. It can feel that the world is spiraling out of control. Journalism gives us our picture of the world, but there are certain biases that are built into the journalistic enterprise. News is about what happens, not what doesn't happen. When something goes wrong, it's gripping. Bad is psychologically stronger than good. When something goes right, often it's nothing. It is a city that has not been shot up by terrorists. It's a country that's been at peace. Since they never count as news, no one will learn about them. If you think that the news has been getting more negative over time, you're right. The major news outlets across the world have been getting steadily more negative over time, even as the objective state of the world has been improving. Let's go to the data, starting with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. But today it is more than 70 years in the world as a whole, more than 80 years in the more fortunate developed parts of the world. 200 years ago, no more than 10% of people in the world lived above the line for extreme poverty. Today, more than 90% do. For most of human history, everyone was illiterate. Today, more than 80% of the population is literate. Fewer people are dying in wars. Fewer people are starving to death. Fewer people are dying of infectious diseases. So as the world gets better and better, the coverage gets more and more negative. Of course there are problems, and many of them are horrendous. But acknowledging the world's progress is not a matter of having a sunny disposition, or wearing rose-colored glasses, or seeing the glass as half full. It's paying attention to the data, paying attention to the hard, cold, objective facts. My biggest hope in writing Enlightenment now is nothing short than changing people's view of the human condition. Recognizing human progress changes your view of the world. If you want to improve the world, there are a few steps to take. First of all, be humble. None of us is infallible, none of us is omniscient. We've got to learn from our mistakes. Second, have some rational confidence. Many things have gotten better thanks to the confidence of people in the past. That should embolden us to try to solve the formidable problems facing us now. Third, have a problem-solving mindset. Don't begin by looking at who to blame, who the evildoers are, whose fault it is. Things naturally fall apart. Problems are inevitable, but problems are solvable. But if we understand the world, and if we set as our goal improving human welfare, we can gradually succeed. Applying human brain power and human sympathy to making people better off is not futile, it's not hopeless. It will never achieve a perfect world, but it can certainly achieve a better world.
And we don't normally think about all the things that went right, and right, that how we ended up where we are right now was the result of hundreds and hundreds, or not thousands and thousands, and even over the last 5 or 10 years of being able to have this world, or being able to say 500 years ago, most of us would have been illiterate. I mean, I think that's a fascinating piece of being able to have this. And I love the idea of humility, which is a deep value I know in Christianity. It's a deep value in Judaism, of being able to say, there are pieces that I don't know, and being able to say, what can we do as individuals and as a society to be able to make our world better? And I think that's one of even the negative pieces that are happening in our world of racism or gun deaths or climate change. These are not insurmountable, insolvable problems. These are problems that are political problems. These are problems that we could solve as human beings. We can. It's not going to solve, may even be too strong of a word, but we can at least make an impact in this kind of way of being able to say, here are things that we could do, and being able to find what's the data that we're missing, that we're not able to talk about here. So I'm going to pause for questions or reactions here, and I'll say a couple last words before, because I know we have to go for the next service at 12, but I would love to hear what people are thinking about.
So this is Mary. I mean, what I've had to sort of reflect on over recent years is that I get to choose what my news is. And I'll absolutely peruse headlines and dig deep into stuff, but I also sometimes go looking for good news, just because I can't digest all the bad news. So I think some of it is in our power to view news that we want to view, and some balance.
And I think that's a great point. And the news is almost by definition, it's immediate, and and one of the challenges that's happening with 24-hour news networks and social media, which is how do you grab the attention? There's not actually that much news that happens 24/7. Jon Stewart, who was the host of The Daily Show, said, look, 24/7 news was created for 9/11, right? 9/11 was something when having 24-hour news networks was actually very valuable for that one thing that has happened in the last 20 years, but they need to be able to get advertisers. So there needs to be manufactured outrage and manufactured pieces where in fact, most people are acting relatively rationally and mostly with positive interactions towards people. And that's not a story that gets told.
I find myself reflecting on like the fight or flight mechanism that's so much a part of our human nature, and how news often triggers that and takes us to a place of non-reflective anxiety, and how useful it is to engage with other sources of media or different perspectives, the trend lines rather than the headlines, that pull us to rational thought as opposed to irrational reactivity. Mm-hmm. And just what a I'm thinking in my own life, in addition to the practice of gratitude I already mentioned, how might I build a practice of trend line thinking, mm-hmm. rather than headline engagement? I don't have an answer to that, but that feels like something that could be really helpful.
Right, that's hard because, and I think that's the practice, and if any of you have ever been leading a team or been on a task force or a committee or been a pastor or a rabbi, you know that most of the feedback that you're going to get is going to be what was wrong with whatever this happened, right? What you're going to hear is these are the different ways in which this was wrong. What we're not seeing is look at all the people who are actually showing up. Look at all the people who are that we're not hearing, that we're able to reach. And so what are the trend lines that we're not necessarily seeing, because the stories, those are the things that need to get lifted up in a variety of different ways. Our immediate reaction is an emotional, almost irrational element, and being able to have a pause and a reflection and a rationality, I think is a huge part of that. And I know we're coming towards the end of our time, so I'm going to say the last couple of thoughts here. One is that I think is also a key piece of this that Pinker talks about, which is the problem-solving mindset. Because there are problems, and the question is, how do we address them? And one of my favorite ones recently is some of the data. You don't always know how to interpret this, but the number of people who are articulating mental health challenges and problems during COVID has gone up, but the number of suicides since last year has actually gone down, and which we don't really know. And why is that? And my sister, who does work in mental health, thinks that one possibility is that when people were grappling with mental health challenges, they knew that they needed to talk to somebody. There was a way to be able to, it destigmatized on having some mental health challenges and being able to get the help that they needed and were looking for. And by the way, if this is something that you're grappling with, I strongly encourage finding people to be able to talk to in this kind of way, that being able to say, look, there is a challenge, there is a problem, there is isolation, there's mental health problems here, but rather than just having it be this overwhelming problem that's going to dominate the world, people were able to say, I need to talk to somebody. And so being able to understand that we're never going to have a perfect world, but what are the ways in which we can make the world better, slowly, slowly, slowly? There's a great line from a rabbi, I can't remember who it is, a Hasidic rabbi, who said, if you don't make tomorrow better than today, then what do you need tomorrow for? And some of that is being able to say, how can we make tomorrow better? And it's not just a Pollyanna-ish, everything's going to be wonderful, because the universe's natural tendency and society's natural tendency is to disintegrate. But if we're able to put time and energy and effort and having those practices of gratitude and connection and relationship, slowly, 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 the trend lines are going to be what we're able to focus on and not the headlines. And so how can we be a rational optimist? Go outside, enjoy the wonderful outdoors, and think about celebrate, as you know, as you all celebrated Easter, we celebrated Passover, which is each spring a holiday of hope and rebirth and opportunity to be able to say, even when something is very dour, even when something looks like it is almost the end of the rope, we can find ways to be able to not find hope and optimism, but create a level of hope and optimism. And so I want to thank you for taking some time here to be able to learn this morning. I'm excited that you'll be able to learn from a couple of our fellows of Eric Ellis and John Van Sloten, who are pastors and good friends and really wonderful thinkers. So thank you for taking the time here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. It's great.
Thank you.
Hope
Thank you.
to have you back soon.
Good things to think about.
Thank you. And I hope I can also send a link. We'll be talking actually with Steven Pinker this upcoming Wednesday. I can send you the link through the chat, and you if you want to ask him questions about this. But we have a weekly interview series. So at jewishlive.org/sacred science on this Wednesday at 2 p.m. we'll be talking with him. And I'm also happy to stay on if there are other questions or pieces as well.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great to see everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you all soon.
Oops.